Hey guys, Tammy here. And today I want to talk about another technique that can be really helpful when you're dealing with, experts or you're facing court or whatever's coming up that you're like having all this anxiety and you're stressed about it. This is a technique that I talk through with my clients, and it's called "What is your worst case scenario?" Now, that might sound like, what? You're going to talk to me about the very worst case? How is that going to help my anxiety? I'm going to tell you. Let me just remind you, if you like this content, you find my videos helpful, don't forget to hit like on this video and also subscribe to the channel so that you're notified as new videos and new content is released. The worst case scenario. A lot of times what happens when we're facing issues, like court or a situation with our kids or whatever it is, I would say most of the time, this technique is something I teach when people are dealing with court because they're anticipating that hearing date, right? It's usually booked out several weeks, if not even a few months. And so you've got sort of this date that's out there looming on the calendar that you're going to have to contend with, right? And so we get anticipatory anxiety around that. And we feel really stressed, and we kind of become almost consumed with thoughts about it and analyzing it and replaying it and figuring out the different scenarios and what might happen and what might not happen, and all the overthinking that you can possibly do, right? I am guilty of this too. I overthink. It's real hard to kind of turn your mind off when you're in that type of anxiety. So one of the things that Thomas used to talk about a lot was, accepting your worst case scenario. I was talking to a client the other day, and in this situation, the other parent is wanting the parents live in different states, right? And one parent is wanting the child to move to the state that they're in, and the child is currently primarily with the other parent, excuse me, in their state. And so, it's a big shift. It's a big shift not only as a parent, but it's a big shift for the child. And this child is a teenager and kind of has their own opinion about, which state they want to live in and all that kind of thing. And so this client had just really made it up in their head to where it was just going to be this horrible, awful, life-ending thing if the other parent won, the court case and got to move the child to their state. And it was causing a lot of stress. And I said, okay, let's just play devil's advocate for a minute, right? Let's walk through, what does that look like? What would be the recovery of it on the other end? So, okay, usually if one parent lives out of state, the other parent will get vast majority of the summer. They'll get half of all the breaks. A lot of times they'll get spring break every year. I see courts do that sometimes. And they also usually have the option to go to the other state to visit the child, one weekend a month or sometimes even a couple weekends a month or whatever, or 5 days at a time or 7 days at a time. It depends on the age of the child, school, all those kinds of things. But the court will usually give that other parent the ability to go see the child in the other state with advanced notice. And then, of course, we are blessed by having a lot of technology, right? So we can, FaceTime and, Skype and Zoom and, all these different platforms that we have where we can do video visits and video chats with each other, which is phenomenal. I use that to stay connected to my grandchildren a lot of times. And I look back, and I lived out of state from my parents when my children were little. And that would have been such a blessing to be able to do that. And my parents actually be able to see the children as they were growing up. We only had telephone at that point. There are a lot of options of how you can still interact with the child and maintain consistent connection with them and stay bonded with them across that distance. Again, something I do with my very young grandchildren, and I've been able to. My oldest grandchild is 6, and I would say I'm tighter with her than just about anybody else in my life, almost, except maybe my kids. So, and she's lived 1,000 miles away her entire life. So it is possible to still have that bond. And I think sometimes we just panic and automatically think, oh my goodness, if this happens, like it feels like I'll never see them. I'll never interact with them. They'll become like this distant part of my life. But that's not true. It may take more effort on your part. You just have to find a way to work around the issues. If that's our worst case scenario, if we say, okay, in this situation, our worst case scenario is summers, holidays, advance notice for extra weekend visits throughout the school year, that's our worst case scenario. Okay, then what? Then after that, you start figuring out, okay, I want to shift this back to them being with me. So how do I do that? Okay. We have to build our case. Thomas used to talk about this, about, you need a runway, so that you can, what most people do is there's one hiccup and they run right into court and they want to shift things back. No, you have to build your case. So are you going to be able to flip that situation within a month or a week or whatever? No, probably not. Can you flip it within 6 months, 12 months? Very likely that you can do something to change the situation within that length of time, depending on, the overall circumstances. So what does that look like? Well, that looks like you maintaining your relationship with the child, right? Going for the extra visits, doing everything that you've got to do. And it also involves you keeping a good record, keeping your logs, making sure that you're behaving well in your messaging and your communication with the other parent. And then to an extent, it's kind of letting things happen, right? A lot of times when children go live with the opposite parent, either number one, the parent might want that to happen, but the child didn't want to move to that state. So especially if that child's older, they're really going to give that parent a lot of grief, right? Teenagers are already a lot of grief, but add on something like that, and there's going to be a whole nother layer of grief. Or a lot of times what's happened is the child has idealized the other parent because they haven't been spending that time with them and they haven't been with them on the day-to-day. And now they're going to go and live with that parent more, and they're going to figure out that that doesn't work too well, and it's going to give you the leverage you need to shift this situation. I chose this to talk about in the worst case scenario because I think this is something that comes up for people, and it has, like I said, recently came up for a client of mine. And, the long distance thing is something that's really difficult for the court to deal with. But this technique of using the worst case scenario can be really helpful regardless of whether you're dealing with somebody moving away or not. It's kind of like, okay, well, let's say that parent gets an extra day a week than what you want them to get. Or let's say your child support goes down, $100 a month. Like, figure out what your worst case scenario is from that. Okay, my worst case scenario from that is I got to disconnect my cable, or I got to disconnect my internet, or I got to find a cheaper phone plan, or I got to whatever. And once you accept that, like, okay, I don't love that, but that's a solution, then your brain will stop obsessing over it. And you'll get some relief from the stress and anxiety of it. And in the move away situation, like I said, a lot of times children have idealized and think they want to go and they really don't. My child did this not in a move away situation, but my younger son, when he was about 14, decided he wanted to live with dad half the time. And he had pretty much lived with me 95% of the time. And I remember having this meltdown and being like, what? This is somebody that hasn't stayed connected to you, hasn't put forth effort. Really, now you want to go live with him half the time? And I remember Thomas saying to me, Tammy, you have to let go and let this happen. Because if you fight it, he's going to be constantly in his head thinking that it would be so much better if he was with his dad. And so I let go and let God, as we say. And it took it was pretty quick, actually, in my scenario. It was about 2 or 3 months, kind of gradually over time, where he started going less and less and less. And I think by about 3 months, he was pretty much back with me 95% of the time. So sometimes our stress, anxiety, our effort to like control things and make sure we get the outcome we want actually is worse. It creates more stress for us. It puts more stress on the situation. And a lot of times, if you're dealing with a teenager or a stubborn co-parent, it'll cause them to dig in and be even more determined not to let the thing that you want happen. So stepping back and letting go can be really helpful. Hard to do until you accept your worst case scenario and say, you know what, if that's my worst case scenario and that's what I have to do, I'll do it. And then I will get on a path, figure out my strategy and get on a path to turning that around over the long haul. That's what I tell parents who are in a position where they're not seeing their kid. I have a lot of parents who are on minimal time or supervised time. That situation is totally changeable. You're in your worst case scenario right now. Okay, so you're in it. You have to accept it and now say, okay, how do I get out of this? What's the strategy? Because many, many parents that I know of end up with a 50-50 parenting plan over a 12-month period or so. That's not uncommon. And so just don't give up and hang in there and try to do what you can to keep your stress and anxiety down, because those things are going to cause you to be emotional and actually cause you to make more mistakes in the situation. Accepting the worst case scenario is actually going to prevent you from compounding the problem that already exists. All right. If you'd like to learn more about my coaching, please go to divorceuniversityonline.com/VIP-coaching. You can book a free strategy session with me. I'd love to talk to you and learn about how I might be able to support you in your child custody. See you guys next time. We'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon.